It was a typical Tuesday morning in Atlanta, but for Monique Bellamy, it was anything but ordinary. The sun hung high, indifferent to the weight of decisions and deals that shaped the city below. Monique, the 42-year-old founder and CEO of Nexrotech Industries, was on the cusp of closing a $2 billion international partnership, a historic deal that would position her firm as a global force in artificial intelligence. She had built her company from scratch, rising from the crowded basement of early-stage tech incubators to the marble floors of Fortune 500 boardrooms. But before the final signatures could be penned, there was one last piece of protocol: in-person identification verification and document notarization, required for security clearance by their banking partner, First Dominion Bank. She dressed like a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. Tailored navy suit, clean lines, no excess. Her briefcase held the contracts, and her heart held the knowledge of what this deal meant not just for her, but for every young black girl who might one day dream of building something just as bold. She entered the downtown Bronx with the confidence of someone who had long since grown used to walking into rooms that weren't built for her and making them haze anyway. The bank was quiet. A few customers lingered, heads bowed over clipboards or smartphones. Monique took her place in line, reviewing a final email from her German partners. They were preparing to wire the funds through First Dominion commercial accounts. Everything was aligned. All she had to do was present her ID and sign a few documents. When her turn came, she approached the counter and smiled. The teller, a man in his late 50s with pale skin, thinning hair, and a clipped expression, barely looked up. His name tag read T. Renner. She slid her ID and business papers through the slot. "Good morning," she said. He didn't respond. He picked up the ID and frowned at it as if it had somehow offended him. He looked at the name. Then he looked at her. Then the name again. "Oh, who?" he asked. "I'm Monique Bellamy," she replied, calmly, "CEO of Nexrotech." He scoffed under his breath. "You're the CEO of a tech company." The way he said it, flat, incredulous, edged in something quietly vicious, made the moment heavy. She nodded, still composed. "Yes." Without a word, he took her ID and walked to the back. 10 minutes passed, then 15. She waited. She could feel eyes on her, some curious, others uncomfortable. Finally, he returned. He didn't hand the ID back. Instead, he tossed it with a flick of his fingers. It bounced off the glass and clattered to the floor at her feet. "You can pick that up," he said. The room went still. Monique's world had taught her to read a room before speaking. She stood for a moment, letting the silence do its work. Then she slowly bent down, picked up her ID, and looked at him. Her voice was even, but her words carried a weight of fire forged under pressure. "You just lost your bank a $2 billion partnership," she said, and she turned and walked out. She didn't scream. She didn't film. She didn't post. She didn't need to. By the time she reached the car, her assistant was already on the phone with Nexrotech's legal team. Monique instructed them to begin the immediate severance of all business with First Dominion Bank. There were 6 accounts involved: commercial, escrow, R&D holdings, and joint venture trust funds. Every dollar was to be moved. By nightfall, her chief financial officer had contacted Felsenmein's GmbH, the German partner, and explained what had happened, not in anger, but in clarity. The funds would no longer be wired through First Dominion. Alternative arrangements were made with a Swiss financial institution within 48 hours. And still, Monique said nothing publicly. There was no press release, no scandal, no televised tears. She did not march. She did not post a photo of her ID on the floor. She understood something deeper. Sometimes the most powerful answer is no response at all, only decisive action. Within First Dominion, confusion turned into panic. Mid-level analysts noticed millions quietly vanishing from active portfolios. Executives couldn't explain the sudden closing of Nexrotech's accounts. The CEO of the bank asked for an internal audit. When the legal department discovered the letter from Nexrotech's legal counsel, one that tersely cited a grave breach of professional trust, there was no apology that could be drafted to undo the damage. The bank's leadership huddled behind closed doors. The marketing team prepared statements in case it leaked. HR quietly dismissed T. Renner under the pretense of policy violations, though the exact offense was never put in writing. Some board members pushed for a public statement, but the PR team warned against it. If she hasn't spoken, they said, it's better we don't either. Monique went on. Her company soared. The German deal expanded, and Nexeratech opened a European headquarters in Munich the following quarter. Investors took note. Competitors tried to understand what had shifted, but they didn't see the moment that mattered because it wasn't captured on camera. It lived only in memory, in the space where disrespect met resolve. Weeks later, during a keynote address at the Global Women in Innovation Conference, Monique took the stage in front of 1,000 entrepreneurs, policymakers, and future leaders. She didn't tell the story directly. She didn't need to, but her closing line hung in the air long after the applause. Sometimes, the most radical thing a black woman can do in business is remain silent and pull every string she owns. The audience rose to its feet, not because she had made a statement, but because she had made a decision, and because she had done what leaders do when they are disrespected. They don't shout back, they move mountains in silence. And somewhere, in a polished corner office with a view of a skyline built on generational wealth, a banker stared out the window, wondering how it all went so wrong, never realizing that it all began with a flick of his fingers and a single ID card left lying on the floor. Weeks passed, and Monique Bellamy never mentioned the bank incident again, not to her board, not to her employees, and not to the public. She didn't need to. The silence she carried was more powerful than any press conference. It was deliberate, calculated, and it was working. Inside Nexeratech headquarters, her team moved with sharpened sense of purpose. The incident had rattled them. Many had heard through hushed conversations among senior staff that something had happened. No one had details, only that a deal worth more than most people's lifetime earnings had been redirected overnight. The office, normally abuzz with innovation and tight deadlines, grew quieter, more focused, like a crew on a ship that had just survived a near collision with an iceberg. What Monique had done was not just move money. She had made a statement to everyone around her about how power is exercised, not through reaction, but through precision. But while she had moved on, the story had not. Inside First Dominion Bank, a different kind of storm had taken hold. The compliance team had flagged the Nexeratech withdrawal as a high-priority anomaly. Confidential internal memos tried to piece together what had gone wrong. The boardroom was quiet, somber. The chief risk officer warned of cascading effects. Word spreads fast in corporate finance. Already, another mid-sized tech firm with ties to Monique's network had begun moving their accounts as well. By the end of the month, nearly $400 million had left First Dominion's tech sector portfolio. Still no public word from Monique. Then one Friday evening, as dusk settled over Atlanta and the streetlights blinked on like a silent witness, a young black intern at First Dominion's headquarters hesitated before walking into the restroom. She had overheard two executives, white men in their late 50s, laughing in the elevator just moments before. I still say she played the race card, one said. You think she really controls that much money? The other chuckled. I doubt she even understood half the deal. Probably just a face on the pitch deck. The Germans were the real brains. The intern, Clara, said nothing. She was only in her third month. But that weekend, sitting alone in her apartment, she began writing. She didn't post a story. She didn't name names. She just wrote. Imagine building an empire in silence and having your credentials tossed on the floor like trash. Imagine having more power in your calm than they've ever had in their loudest boardroom. Imagine the world never hearing about it. Not because it didn't matter, but because the person it happened to was already too powerful to explain herself. The post didn't go viral overnight, but it grew, quietly, steadily, the way truth always does when it's written from the gut. People began to speculate. Tech bloggers caught wind. Then an industry reporter followed a money trail from Nexeratech's account to a mysterious closure at First Dominion. It didn't take long before a headline finally appeared. Major tech firm quietly exits top U.S. bank. CEO cite professional misconduct in sealed letter. The story never confirmed Monique's name, but the pieces were easy to connect. The post Clara wrote started getting shared, first by employees, then investors, and then by women across every industry. Suddenly, Monique Bellamy was being called the quiet storm in business circles. Journalists requested interviews. News channels offered full-hour specials. PR representatives begged her to speak. Even a few social justice organizations called, hoping to build campaigns around the incident. But she declined them all. She had a different plan. Instead of telling her story, Monique began building something new. She allocated $50 million into a new initiative, Project Vault, a fintech accelerator specifically designed to support black women entrepreneurs who had been denied traditional financial services. Her goal wasn't to destroy First Dominion. That was never her focus. Her mission was always bigger, to make sure the next Monique Bellamy never had to ask a teller for respect again. The announcement of Project Vault sent a shockwave through the industry. Dozens of small businesses applied in the first week. Within a month, Monique had quietly onboarded 2 former banking executives, both women of color, who had resigned from national banks citing racial bias in loan underwriting. And then came the call she hadn't expected. It was from the CEO of Felsen Mines GmbH, the German partner in the original $2 billion deal. He didn't want to discuss business. He wanted to talk about what had happened. "Monique," he said, his voice deep and weary, "I wish we had known. We never would have worked with them if..." She cut him off gently. "You know now," she said, "so build with us. Help me change what banking looks like for people who were never invited to the table." He paused, then agreed. The new partnership wasn't just profitable. It became historic. 6 months later, Nexratech and Felsen Mines unveiled Ethos, a blockchain-based trust and lending platform designed for underbanked founders in emerging markets. It was a massive risk. The tech was new, the mission was bold, and the bankers were skeptical. But it worked. Monique's silence that day in the bank had not just shut a door, it had opened a new one. One that led to an entirely different future. A future where women who looked like her could walk into any bank, any boardroom, any summit, not to prove themselves, but to lead. And so the story of an ID card on the floor became something more. It became legend, not because of the slap it delivered to a bloated institution, but because of the wave it set in motion. One woman, one decision, one refusal to be humiliated, and an empire that only grew stronger. They called her the Quiet Storm, but she was never quiet. She just knew how to wait until the world could hear her thunder. Months had passed since Monique Bellamy walked out of that bank with her ID card tossed at her feet. Time, in its silent movement, had done what it always does. It exposed the cracks, widened the gaps, and made room for transformation. What began as a moment of personal insult had triggered a series of choices that were anything but reactive. Monique didn't look back. She didn't dwell. She built. While the media speculated and social threads tried to fill in the blanks, Monique turned her full focus to what mattered most: control of her company, her capital, and her legacy. Project Vault was only the beginning. Nexratech became a flagship firm for next-gen AI development in ethical data systems, and its financial arm, forged from the ashes of First Dominion's failure, began attracting attention across the globe. In a time when trust in traditional financial systems was eroding, Monique offered something different. Not just innovation, but integrity. Not just numbers, but narratives. Ones that had been overlooked, silenced, or erased. She started quietly funding founders who had been denied credit. A black woman in Detroit building a smart logistics startup. A single mother in Nairobi designing a decentralized energy grid. A formerly incarcerated coder in Oakland writing quantum security algorithms. Monique never asked for credit. She didn't need her name on buildings. She was building people. Meanwhile, inside First Dominion, things were no longer quiet. The bank's quarterly reports were increasingly padded with strategic language that masked losses. Phrases like portfolio realignment and market contraction peppered the internal memos. One board member resigned without warning. Another leaked a statement to a financial columnist, implying that the bank's leadership had squandered an opportunity to support one of the most promising companies of the decade. An internal audit revealed something deeper. Nexratech wasn't just a client. It had been an anchor. Its movement had triggered others. Venture firms that co-invested with Nexratech began re-evaluating their own banking relationships. Several shifted to more inclusive fintech firms. The bleeding wasn't just about money anymore. It was about reputation. And in banking, reputation is everything. Still, Monique said nothing. She refused interviews. She turned down profiles. A prestigious magazine offered her their cover. She politely declined. The media couldn't understand it. This woman who had more reach than a senator, who could sway markets with a whisper, yet didn't seek the spotlight. But that's because Monique had begun building something even more daring, the Citadel Institute. It was not a school, though it had teachers. Not a think tank, though it produced ideas. Not a bank, though it held the power of one. It was a place where marginalized innovators could access the kind of resources usually reserved for those born into boardrooms. A fusion of capital, curriculum, and culture. The first Citadel campus was in Atlanta. The second, Lagos. The third, Sao Paulo. And they were growing. Monique sat at the head of it all, not as a savior, but as an architect. She didn't give handouts. She gave blueprints. Her model wasn't charity. It was ecosystem engineering. Back at First Dominion, they attempted damage control. They hired a new diversity officer. They launched a glossy campaign showing people of color smiling at counters. They made public donations to youth STEM programs. But it didn't change what had happened. Because what they had lost was not just a client. It was a current. And it had shifted. The world was changing. Power was no longer seated only in towers of glass or vaults of stone. It was flowing toward communities that had been ignored, voices that had been dismissed, and leaders like Monique who had nothing left to prove. And then, nearly a year to the day after that morning at the bank, Monique received an invitation. A private note, handwritten, delivered by courier. It was from one of the remaining senior executives at First Dominion. He was retiring. And with his departure, he wanted to finally speak plainly, as he wrote. The letter was full of regrets. Regrets about what was done, what wasn't said, what wasn't stopped. He apologized not just for what happened, but for the years of systems that made it possible. He asked for a meeting. No PR, no statements, just a conversation. Monique never responded. Instead, she passed the letter on to one of her Citadel fellows, a young woman who had just launched her own banking app for rural communities in the South. The kind of founder who wouldn't have lasted 5 minutes in the old system. She wrote only one sentence on the envelope before handing it over. Your time is done. Hayes is just beginning. The fellow read the letter, folded it, and placed it into a glass display at Citadel's Atlanta campus, labeled The Death of Old Power. And the world kept turning. Monique Bellamy continued her wake, not loudly, not for cameras, but in every startup she backed, every coder she mentored, every unjust door she replaced with a new one made of steel and sunlight. There were still whispers about that day in the bank. People wanted the full story, but Monique never told it, because in the end, it wasn't about the teller. It wasn't even about the bank. It was about what happens when a black woman is underestimated for the last time. And what happens after when no one sees her coming, because they were too busy looking down. Years passed, and Monique Bellamy's name became a fixture in rooms that had once denied her entry, not because she demanded it, but because her impact no longer allowed her to be ignored. By now, Nexratech was a household name in the global tech ecosystem. Its AI ethics frameworks had become the gold standard in dozens of countries. Its satellites monitored climate zones across the globe. Its tools had mapped the digital inequality of entire nations. And yet, through it all, Monique stayed elusive. She refused corporate awards. She turned down speaking fees. She rarely signed autographs. But people followed her anyway, because everything she touched turned into a mirror, reflecting back to the world what had always been hidden, potential that never asked permission. But the Citadel Institute was her most dangerous creation. Dangerous, not because it threatened the world, but because it threatened the world as it had been. It had grown 6 campuses worldwide, each one an ecosystem of radical thinkers, underestimated builders, and people who had been told no their whole lives. They were rewriting every assumption in finance, tech, medicine, media, and education. And they weren't asking for seats at anyone's table. They were building their own tables, custom cut, locally sourced, and unshakably grounded in the communities they came from. One day, a documentary crew was granted rare access to Citadel's Johannesburg campus. They interviewed students who once lived in tin roof shelters but now coded next-generation data encryption. They filmed lectures by engineers who'd been denied visas in the past but were now inventing battery-free infrastructure for hospitals in war zones. But when the crew asked to interview Monique, they were politely declined. Instead, she left them a voice note. "If you want a story, don't look at me. Look at them. I'm not the movement. I just lit the fuse." And the fuse was burning bright. But still, there were those watching from the old world. Watching closely, uncomfortably. There were whispers in certain boardrooms about how the Citadel model was disrupting institutional order. One senator, during a closed-door session, described Monique's influence as soft power with a hard spine. Financial news outlets began referring to her as the architect, the one reshaping how power moved. Then came the real tremor. A coalition of Citadel graduates announced a proposal to create the world's first fully decentralized equity exchange, where founders could raise capital without intermediaries, where algorithmic bias was eliminated, and where access was defined by talent, not pedigree. It wasn't a dream. It was already an alpha, and its beta would go live in 12 months. Wall Street took notice. So did Washington. Lobbyists laced their briefcases with warnings. Regulators scrambled to understand code written by teenagers from Brazil, Kenya, and New Orleans. The headlines weren't subtle. The end of venture capital as we know it. Citadel alumni launched platform to rewrite ownership. The architect shadow looms over global finance. And yet, through all of it, Monique remained silent. She was no longer a CEO. She had quietly stepped down from Nextratech, handing leadership to a trio of women she had mentored since their college years. Each one brilliant. Each one from a background that would have barred them from entry in any other era. She simply called them the new architects. She moved to Ghana, built a quiet home on the coast. No private jets, no entourage. She spent mornings barefoot in the red soil, watching the sea, her mind still moving, always 5 years ahead. One morning, a young girl approached her, shy and wide-eyed. She had walked miles from her village to find Monique. She held a hand-stitched notebook in her hands, full of ideas, drawings, circuits, equations, dreams. Monique knelt down, looked her in the eye, and said, "What do you want to build?" The girl didn't hesitate. "A school," she said, "that teaches girls like me to build the future." Monique smiled. "Then let's begin." That school would open 3 years later. It would be named The Floor, because, as Monique once told the first class of students, that's where they tried to leave me. And that's where I built my foundation. And somewhere, thousands of miles away, in a gray boardroom with polished oak walls, a man sat staring at a quarterly report. Profits were down. Innovation was gone. Relevance was slipping. He sighed, rubbed his temples, and whispered aloud, "Where did we lose it?" He didn't know the answer. But you did, because it was never about a bank, never about an ID. It was always about a moment. And what happens after? A woman walked into a bank, and the world was never the same again.